Thank you, David. Of course, I cannot replace Doris Andoni with her eloquent and very experienced way of reflecting discussions. But nevertheless, I try to do my best. We had several presentations, most of them focused on funding and financing of social housing. The topic of session 5, of course, it was social housing as part of the housing market. There was one presentation from UN Habitat, from Krzysztof Mularczyk, about new approaches of UN Habitat to face the crisis and face the challenges, particularly in developing countries. They have developed a new tool which is called experimental reimbursable seeding operations, which has already attained funding and is in implementation in several countries in Africa and Asia. Then we had a presentation, a very interesting presentation of Sherar Bakar, who is president of the Global Housing Foundation in Europe, which is a particular private sector approach to solve the problems of social housing. That is to say, the Global Housing Foundation is providing financing for people who are, by principle, not bankable, in cooperation with local developers, in cooperation with local banks and local construction companies. What they do is that they buy some 90% of mortgages given by a local bank to eligible households. The eligibility criteria are defined by the Global Housing Foundation. In this way, it is possible for them to provide decent houses or apartments for about 15 to 20,000 euro or dollar, which is substantially below market level of the respective countries. They have already done some very successful projects, particularly in Central America and South America. One example in Guatemala, they did their first projects, and right now they have already reached a volume of some 4,000 units. Now they want to step into Central Europe, Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia with the same approach, but one major difference, and that is that in these regions they want to go into multi-apartment housing instead of slum recovery and single-family houses as they have done in Guatemala and other places in South America. From my side, I introduced a financing scheme which I have called structured financing for social housing in Central Eastern Europe. We made already some experience in Montenegro with this tool, which allows for rental dwellings with €2.50 per square meter monthly annuities in the central regions and far below €2 in remote parts of Montenegro. Similar schemes we are going to develop for other countries such as Romania and Albania, which is in the planning phase. So financing and funding of social housing was the major part of my session, but other aspects have been highlighted as well. One is institution building. So we came to the result that to attain sufficient supply of affordable housing, it is not only necessary to have sufficient funds for construction of these buildings, but it is of major importance to have institutions and capacities who organize this. This is particularly important if you have rental housing with long-term financial obligations. For rental housing, it is necessary to have capacities, to have institutions who act not only as a housing developer, but as a housing investor as well, and a housing manager. That is to say, very comprehensive, complex, complicated skills which have to be focused in organizations that have to be established we came to the result that building up such capacities is succeeded in the best way if the responsibles in these countries, if the governments commit for a new business model. We propose a scheme of PPP housing, public-private partnership housing, which is to say it ought to be private companies or cooperatives or other institutions which act in the framework of a distinct legal scheme in these countries based on private market economy, based on private law, but fulfilling public service obligations. For these activities, they have access to subsidies from the state and land and infrastructure from the municipalities. Of course, as they build up assets with taxpayers' money, it is necessary to have extensive auditing and supervisory standards for these companies. All over Europe, in Western Europe, we have very good examples of successful sectors of the kind. Mr. de Jong explained in detail the activities in the Netherlands. Myself, I spoke a little bit about the social housing sector in Austria. Additionally, Mr. de Jong spoke about the activities of the umbrella organization, the European platform of social housing companies in Europe, SECODAS, placed in Brussels, a representation of interests of social housing companies all over Europe, with some activities in CEE countries, but it has to be mentioned that CEE countries are underrepresented in this organization, as only national umbrella organizations are members of this platform, and CEE countries do not have sectors and hence do not have national umbrella organizations. That is to say, it could be a place for REM to step in to fill this gap and focus on the establishment of social housing sectors in CEE countries, in transition countries, and in developing countries as well. Another aspect was that beside of financing and institution building, it will be necessary to have a focus on the legal environment. This is again a question facing PPP housing. We have developed a PPP housing law for Romania, and we are going to apply it for Montenegro right now. I think it is a major starting point if we want to have top-down approach from the national governments. It has to be in form of a legal framework. Finally, we have spoken about the role of REM. I think it could be, as I have mentioned before, to focus on transition economies, to transition countries, to help them to build up social housing sectors. It could be to merge existing initiatives. We have heard today of at least 2 initiatives regarding funding of social housing. I think it could be a real beneficial activity of UNECE and REM to bring existing initiatives together with people who have demand for such services and such funding sources. Regarding the guidelines, the REM guidelines on real estate market development, we have some comments. We have got some comments. Peter Kreutzer already mentioned some aspects concerning Principle 9. Additional comments have concerned government responsibilities. That is to say, one of the participants initiated that we should consider a sentence that the governments are responsible for the establishment of social housing markets. there should be a sentence concerning capacity building and organization building to realize social housing. That's the major points. And one aspect which I have discussed with Peter Kreutzer in the lunch break was, if we want to make the REM guidelines a more comprehensive paper, it might be a reasonable strategy to take the previous paper as such kind of executive summary and to add an additional chapter including materials to each of the principles. For some principles, it might be sufficient only to have a link to existing studies which are already worked out from UNECE. To other principles, it might make sense to provide additional information for the people who are addressed by our REM guidelines. For example, for Principle 9 on social housing, I have detected some deficiencies in information. So some people told me they would like to have more information on the principles on the dependencies between governments, private sector, social landlords, and so on. So that could be a useful and meaningful complement to the existing guidelines. And finally, my final point, we have pointed out that a collection of best practice would make sense. In this respect as well, UNECE has already done very worthwhile work in previous studies. So that's my point.